Hello everybody, this is going to be a quick video over how violent media, both violent video games, violent movies, can impact or influence aggression. Now, I mentioned elsewhere in other videos that I have a lot of friends who love to game. And so, a couple of my friends are really into a very violent game known as Dark Souls. And there are I'm sure there are other more violent games that some of my friends are in. But very often, in fact, I've had to talk about this with some of my friends. Basically, they brought it up and I had to tell them the evidence. But I have a lot of gaming friends who insist violent video games don't affect aggression. And that's actually a common belief, that violence doesn't influence aggression. However, about 40 years of research now shows that, yeah, it does. And it's backed up not only by correlational evidence, so we not only know that people who play more hours of aggressive games tend to endorse or engage in more aggression than people who play fewer hours of violent video games. Not only that, it's also been backed up by experimental research. People exposed to violent games and violent movies versus peaceable games and peaceable movies tend to aggress more and be less sensitive to aggression. So how is it that exposure to violent media, either games or movies, can increase aggression? Well, you can do so by at least 3 mechanisms. 1, priming. All right. Priming simply refers to when exposure to something makes information accessible in memory. Well, if you're watching a violent movie, fighting becomes accessible in memory. Being angry becomes accessible in memory. All right. We also, so once that information is accessible, information that is accessible in memory then gets used to guide our behavior. When we're trying to decide what to do about something, the information that's accessible in memory gets used to deal, is what guides us in figuring out how to deal with it. So, if we've walked out of a very violent movie, right, or we've walked out of the house after playing a very violent video game and somebody cuts us off, we're probably going to be more prone to tailgate them or flip them off. I almost did. Sorry. So when we're exposed to violent media, this increases the accessibility. Accessibility is how available in memory something is. It increases the accessibility of violent material in our minds, making it more likely that we will reference that material when we're behaving out in the everyday world. Okay. Another way that violent media can increase aggression is through something called excitation transfer. Now, excitation transfer can have a lot of consequences in a lot of different domains. But with aggression, if we watch a violent video game or play a violent video game or watch a violent movie, those are action-packed sequences very often, right? So if, before making this video, me and my wife were watching a scene, and I forget the name of the movie, but in which 2 cops were chasing down criminal and there was a big fight, etc. There's a lot of action in that, right? And that gets the heart rate up. That increases your arousal. Well, we know then that arousal, people use their context to interpret their arousal. So if, after watching that video, I'd come in here and my computer didn't want to work or it was doing silly things, I'd probably, after having watched that violent scene, and having my arousal higher, I'd probably be more prone to, slam my mouse or want to type harder or something like that, right? Because that arousal gets attributed to what I'm doing, and if the computer is frustrating me, then that arousal gets applied. The excitation from the violent scene that I have from the violent scene gets transferred to what I'm doing. All right, so trying to figure out how to make my computer work. So the excitation from watching the violent game gets transferred to trying to fix my computer, which can lead me to be a little bit more violent. So that's another way. A third way is through modeling. Okay, when we're watching a lot of violent movies, when we're playing a lot of violent games, we're watching people deal with their problems in violent ways. And what that does is it creates a script for us. It gives us an aggressive script. It tells us, hey, if you're wanting to deal with a problem, you can do that by acting aggressively. Okay? So video games aren't the only thing that can model aggression for us. People often model aggression for us, and people model aggression for us more than video games certainly do. And certainly we see this, that people who grow up in violent neighborhoods, who grow up with families who are a little bit more violent, all right, in these situations, kids are modeling their parents and people in their neighborhoods violent behavior. And this can contribute to a cycle of aggression or a cycle of violence. Because if someone's raised in a house where they have seen their parents be aggressive with one another, that aggression, dealing with problems aggressively, becomes a script for them. It becomes a script is a behavioral schema. A schema is a template or a general understanding of a topic. And so a behavioral schema is your idea of how to behave with in a certain context. And so if you're learning an aggressive script, which is a behavioral schema, you're learning that when I face this problem, I should behave in this aggressive way. And so when I encounter that problem in the future, I use that aggressive script and I behave aggressively. So a lot of things can model aggressive behavior for us, including violent media and violent video games. I say all this as my wife is playing a violent video game in the other room, and I can literally hear the explosions and her swear at the game. So case in point, and I don't know if you can hear her, but I certainly can. So if you can hear that, sorry about that. Now, the last mechanism that I wanted to discuss is that by which violent media and violent movies can increase aggression is desensitization. Desensitization is something that happens anytime we are overexposed to something. If we were overexposed to sugar, right, and you've probably experienced this, all right, this is perceptual contrast. If you, let's say you had a spoonful of butter, gross, sorry, no, a spoonful of peanut butter, all right, some of you might even say gross to that. I know my wife would. But let's say you had a spoonful of peanut butter, right, and then you went to get an apple, all right. Well, if you, after having that spoonful of peanut butter, right, and then you bite into that apple probably isn't going to taste as sweet. But if you had flipped it, right, so you eaten the apple first and then had the peanut butter, that apple probably would have been sweeter. Well, why? Well, when you eat the peanut butter off the spoon, right, you're becoming desensitized to sugar. And so when you eat the apple, it has less sugar in it. And so it's going to taste less sweet. Well, we become desensitized to a lot of things, including violence. So when we're watching a violent movie, we become desensitized to violence. When we're playing hours and hours and hours of a violent video game, we become desensitized to the violence. So, you know, we're watching, let's say we see somebody punch somebody else, right? Well, if we had just walked out of a Rocky movie or one of the Avengers movies, or we had just walked away from playing Doom or Diablo or something, right? If we had just walked away from watching one of these movies or playing one of these games, and they're cool movies and great games, I'm not saying anything about that, but they're violent. And so once we walk out of that, if we had come from that and then saw somebody punch somebody else, we probably wouldn't be taken back by that punch as much as we would be if we maybe walked out of a more peaceful movie like I don't know, What Dreams May Come. Apparently I can only think of old movies. Sorry. So that's the final way, or at least a fourth way. I'm sure there's other ways that violent media and violent video games can affect us, but those are at least four. All right. So one, it can prime us with violent information and memory. Two, it can increase our baseline level of arousal, which we then, so it can increase our excitation, which we then transfer to something else. So if we're met with a frustration, that arousal gets transferred to the frustrator, to the way we deal with the frustrator. Violent video games and movies can model aggressive scripts for us, just like violent parents and violent neighborhoods can. And finally, exposure to violent media, games, movies can desensitize us to aggression. All right, guys, that is it for this video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I hope you have a great week. I'll see you later.